Welcome to Biosafety Now's 13th Twitter Space. My name is Bryce Nichols. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University and lab director at the Waxman Institute of Microbiology, and I'm one of the co-founders and leadership team members of Biosafety Now. Biosafety Now is a US-based nonprofit organization that launched in February of this year. We're led by experts in biomedicine, mathematics, public health, public policy, law, social science, and public advocacy. And our core mission is to work for a future where scientific research on pathogens supports human life without threatening it, and public trust in science is restored. To learn more about Biosafety Now's mission, you can visit our website at biosafetynow.org. I'm joined tonight by two other members of Biosafety Now's leadership team, Justin Kenny, who's also a co-founder. Justin's a professor of quantitative biology at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and Yana Lamberdinu, who is a medical anthropologist, affiliate faculty in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech, and co-founder of the Campaign for Lead-Free Water. So I'm going to now turn this space over to Yana, who's going to introduce today's topic and our three guests. I believe Alina is going to be joining us in just a little bit. So go ahead, Yana.
Hi, hello everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So welcome everyone. We are delighted to host this Twitter space today. And we hope that this conversation will help us all wrap our heads around some of the many important developments of the last few weeks on the origin of COVID and high-risk pathogen research. So three quick highlights about what has happened. And as you listen to them, maybe try to think about scientists' responsibility to society, whether these scientists are in the government or academia, and whether they are in the role of investigator, funder, or funding recipient. So highlight one. In March, President Biden signed into law a bill that was passed unanimously by the House and Senate to require the Director of National Intelligence to declassify as much information as possible about the origin of COVID-19. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence responded to the request on June 23rd, 5 days past the legal deadline, in a report that was a mere 10 pages long. Highlight 2. On June 29, The Intercept's Jimmy Tobias published an explosive piece about emails by David Morenz, a high-ranking official at the National Institutes of Health and top advisor to Anthony Fauci. These emails were obtained by investigators from the Republican-led Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic and were addressed to a small group of virologists who had been among some of the most aggressive proponents of the market origin of COVID hypothesis. In them, Dr. Morenz disparages scientists and media outlets who are giving credence to the hypothesis that SARS-CoV-2 may have resulted from research-related activities. He encourages suing some of the quote-unquote lab leakers for slander, and he explains how he was gaming the system to protect his communications from Freedom of Information Act requests and ultimately from public scrutiny. Highlight 3. Yesterday, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic held a hearing titled Investigating the Proximal Origin of a Cover-Up. The purpose of this hearing was to, quote, examine the potential conflicts of interest and suppression of scientific discourse by the National Institutes of Health surrounding the drafting, publication, and critical reception of the infamous The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2 Correspondence, unquote. This is the historic March 2020 letter by 5 leading proponents of the market origin of COVID hypothesis, which asserts the belief that a laboratory-based origin scenario is implausible. This highly influential letter was published in the journal Nature Medicine and was amplified by media outlets across the world. It spawned an ideology of disbelief in a research-related scenario and generated a discourse that stigmatized anyone who challenged this ideology as an anti-science conspiracist, if not worse. In short, This was a letter that shut down honest inquiry about a pandemic that has left the world reeling from death and disability. At the same time, it painted the scientists who may have created, enabled, or supported the research that may have caused the COVID-19 pandemic as some combination of victim, hero, martyr. Yesterday's witnesses were two of the 5 proximal origin authors, Christian Andersen and Robert Gary. For what it's worth, both were participants in the email communications of NIH's David Morenz. So before I introduce our esteemed guests, I'd like to reflect for a minute on the hearing and then connect back to the National Intelligence Declassification and the Morenz emails. The hearing left me with cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, we heard statements disputing, proactively and authoritatively, allegations of wrongdoing. For example, we heard that, contrary to criticism, behind-the-scenes talk about writing a statement that disproves the research-related hypothesis reflected, quote-unquote, textbook science in action, because textbook science necessitates developing a hypothesis and then testing it by trying to disprove it. We also heard that, contrary to criticism, there was no connection between the strong market origin position of the proximal origin letter and the author's NIH funding, since funding decisions on a specific grant had been made months before the writing of the letter. And we also heard that, contrary to criticism, the virus's furin cleavage site is, quote-unquote, suboptimal, and therefore a clear result of natural selection. There is power in such claims, because I believe that most people, including many scientists, are not in a position to question them. There is power in such claims because I think that they can create a smokescreen that shapeshifts individuals right in front of our eyes from likely betrayers of science, truth, and the public good to model defenders of science, truth, and the public good. My cognitive dissonance came from what has struck me as unspeakably secretive, simplistically minded, and aggressive behavior by proximal origin authors, their enablers, and their supporters, which does not comport with the behavior you'd expect from scientists conducting textbook science during a devastating human crisis. My cognitive dissonance also came from knowledge about the dependence of researchers on funders and the significant power imbalance between the two, which means that most scientists who need grants flowing their way to maintain their careers would find it risky to go against the stated or implied wishes of their funders, even if their last grant application had been officially approved. And I think that this is especially the case in the context of a global pandemic that has killed millions of innocent people and can threaten reputations and careers, as well as the very survival of a scientific subfield. Lastly, my cognitive dissonance came from hearing authoritative claims, such as, for example, the quote-unquote suboptimal, crap, and out-of-frame nature of SARS-CoV-2's furin cleavage site, which reflected clear judgment calls, but which lacked explanation and transparency, and therefore demanded of listeners like myself to blindly substitute our judgment with the judgment of the witnesses, and to, most importantly, leave those witnesses unquestioned and unaccountable. So when we connect yesterday's hearing to the National Intelligence Report and the Morenz emails, a question that comes up is this: is it possible that when scientists are culpable, or may be culpable, for serious public harm, the scientific community and its powerful network of supporters in the mainstream media and in award, reward, and funding bodies are conditioned to close ranks behind the confirmed or possible wrongdoers? Is it possible that this closing of ranks involves weaponizing scientific authority against the very public on which the harm has been inflicted, and in the process recast potential wrongdoers into victim, hero, martyrs, that if anything, deserve more financial support rather than less. Therefore, is it possible that the scientific establishment's efforts to self-defend rest on a new layer of assault on society, which is institutionally sanctioned and which confuses, gaslights, hoodwinks, and most importantly, stigmatizes critical thought, and which forces public acquiescence and support? And if all this is possible, as I believe it is, and as I believe it extends beyond the field of virology and the COVID-19 pandemic, what does it tell us about the scientific community's ability to self-police? What does it tell us about the scientific community's ability to promote the public good when such good competes with professional interests? What does it tell us about the expectation articulated by some at yesterday's hearing that we should let scientists continue to do their job rather than interrogate them about their potentially harmful work? And what does it tell us about what we as a society must do to support science that advances humanity without at the same time threatening our health, well-being, and very lives? With this, I would like to introduce our three guests, all of whom have been targeted by members of the scientific establishment for daring to question the proximal origin dogma. Alina Chan is a molecular biologist and scientific advisor at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. She is a recent Broad Ignite Fellow and Human Frontier Science Program Fellow with a background in medical genetics, synthetic biology, and genetic engineering. She is co-author, together with our guest Matt Ridley, of the 2021 book, Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19. She is also a member of the Pathogens Project, which is a task force convened by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to generate new thinking on responsible high-risk pathogen research. Emily Kopp is an investigative reporter specializing in health policy. She uses primary source records to obtain information related to the origins of COVID-19 at the nonprofit investigative public health research and journalism group U.S. Right to Know. Before that, Emily led coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic for Congressional Quarterly and Roll Call, a storied newspaper focusing on Capitol Hill. There, Emily broke many critical stories, including that the CDC was asking nurses to wear bandanas, the emergent biosolutions meltdown, and Chamber of Commerce lobbying to shield themselves from liability from COVID deaths. And last but not least, Matt Ridley. Matt is a science journalist and nonfiction book writer with training in evolutionary biology. He served as science editor for The Economist and founded the Mind and Matter column in the Wall Street Journal. His many books include Viral: The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, which he co-authored with Alina Chan. Matt sat in the UK House of Lords between 2013 and 2021 and served on the Science and Technology and the Artificial Intelligence Select Committees. He started his journey into the SARS-CoV-2 origins question, trusting the proximal origin paper, but unlike I think many journalists, quickly making a U-turn. Welcome to you all. It's a great honor to have this conversation with you today. And I'd like to begin by asking you all the same question. This question is, what are the 1 to 3 key messages that you would want every member of the public to take away from yesterday's hearing? If you can respond briefly in a bullet point fashion, it would be great, because that will give us time to follow up with Alina, who has to leave early. So, Emily, I'm turning to you. You were present at the hearing yesterday. Would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Yana. I'll keep it brief. I think for me, the number one takeaway, big picture, is just how enormously this conversation has changed over the last 3 years. These virologists were saying people who believe in a possible lab origin of COVID were conspiracy theorists not that long ago. And basically, just as evidence has accumulated and people like Alina and Matt have kept asking questions, they've had to concede that it's very possible. And I think, we can get into the weeds on what questions, Republicans nailed and which questions they didn't nail. But I think seeing Christian Anderson say, scientists who disagree with me are not conspiracy theorists, I think that was huge. So that's my main takeaway.
Thank you so much. Matt?
Great to be with you, and terrific introduction, Jana. Very interesting. What did I take away from the hearing? Well, I'm afraid the first thing I took away was that it was a bit of a flop, in the sense that, as you say, it allowed the two scientists to present themselves as victim, martyr, heroes, and pretend that what they had done was perfectly normal science. I think, however, on further reflection, it won't have done that line of argument an awful lot of good, because it has very clearly shown that a group of people changed their mind very substantially between, over a few days, in a very short space of time. And when asked why and how they had changed their minds, they really gave very unpersuasive answers. Robert Gary, for example, was asked how he changed his mind so quickly. He mentioned the pangolins. Those were mentioned at the time, as we know, by Christian Anderson as well. And it was very quickly clear to everybody, including Christian Anderson, in an email to Nature, as we now know, that the pangolins were not the solution to the problem, that the pangolins did not have a furin cleavage site, so they couldn't possibly justify a natural origin for the virus. Gary went on to say that he was persuaded by lots of other scientific findings. When asked what, he said, "Oh, things in the literature." So I think on reflection, this will gradually expose to the public how a story was concocted that was quite different in public from what was being said in private, and that is a huge problem for science and other organizations.
Thank you, Matt. Alina?
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from me from the hearing yesterday was that this was not a particularly transparent or scientific example of how important science should be done. So this group of scientists had gathered together in early 2020 to try and disprove a lab origin, an accidental lab origin. So not even the HIV insertion like nonsense in their own words, but they were trying to disprove any type of lab origin. And you can see how conflicted they were. They were really debating, trying to see if there was enough evidence to rule out even an accidental lab leak, but they could not get it. Instead, what you saw in there were questions about them of what would happen if they were to suggest a lab leak. Would that lead to a shit show? Would that lead to international harmony being disrupted? And so I think what is not good here is that a lot of the public is perceiving, whether rightly or not, that scientists may not always be acting like scientists. They're actually considering the political ramifications of their actions. And in that sense, why should you trust scientists more than you trust politicians? So I'm hoping that the next hearings can focus more on the science now. So we kind of understand that scientists are influenced by politics and by personal consequences, but now we should really turn back to the origins and ask why, if this group of scientists were so keen on understanding whether the virus had escaped from a lab, why did they not go to the NIH and say, can you pull up all the progress reports that EcoHealth and with the Wuhan Institute had sent through to you, especially the most recent ones, to see what sort of experiments they were up to? That didn't seem to be done. The only trace of what I could see happen in that time was through FOIAs. So it looks like Anthony Fauci, one of the Fab First phone call participants, had later reached out to Ralph Barrick and had a private meeting with him in his office in February 2020, talking about chimeric SARS-like viruses and the Wuhan lab. So I think that there should be a more full-hearted investigation into what evidence exists in the US that has not been tapped into to tell us whether the virus might have escaped from that lab in Wuhan.
Thank you, Alina. So I have a follow-up question for you. So watching the hearing, I was particularly struck by the adherence of the proximal origins authors to the specific arguments that they made in proximal origins, as well as other arguments that they've made later. I consider a lot of these arguments to be quite specious. And Anderson particularly made these arguments in a very confident manner. And I worry that came across well, but I was wondering, would you be able to say a bit about your impression of the specific scientific arguments they made, that Anderson and Gary made in their testimony, and the validity of those arguments?
Yeah, so this is a big problem. Is that when the proximal origin authors are giving public testimonies or interviews, there often is not another expert in the room to counter any errors or misinformation that's coming out of them. So in this case, for example, in their writing of proximal origins, they made several very I think unreasonable assumptions that they basically think they know everything that's happening in that Wuhan lab, which thankfully they were called on during the hearing yesterday. Is that they acknowledged that the biosafety levels in that lab were insufficient to be working with these types of novel SARS-like viruses poised for human emergence. They acknowledged that they had not checked with EcoHealth to see what if they knew more about the experiments done at the WIV. They acknowledged that they did not access the virus database of the WIV. So they acknowledged that science is not always published in real time, that there's often a lag of years. So you don't know what's happening in a lab in Wuhan, especially a lab, an institute that we know has classified projects and works with the military in China. So all of these things are often not uh, described in scientific publications, because scientific publications tend to be very focused on dry technical facts. And in the absence of someone fact checking them in real life, calling them out on these assumptions, they can often give the appearance that the science is clear, that there's no evidence. But this phrase, no evidence, often means that they've searched but have limited access. And so when you look at the intelligence community, for example, there are two agencies now. The FBI rules with moderate confidence that this virus came from a lab in Wuhan. The DOE also says that likely it came from a lab in Wuhan, but with low confidence. So these two agencies have the most scientific expertise. They are not making these assessments based on no evidence. It's just that there's no direct evidence. And so I think without someone to directly counter many of these arguments that proximal origin authors are making, they can get away with making it look like the science says one thing.
I want to follow up on that. So the well, okay, so right, so there are these arguments, and then I was going. I found some statements in the opening statements by Anderson and Gary to be really strange. So one is this fine parsing of language that Anderson seemed to engage in to distinguish purposely engineered viruses from other sorts of genetically manipulated viruses. Do you have any comments about that and the relevance of that for their argument?
So I think one thing that stood out to me from all of these Slack messages and emails, and actually there are much longer forms of these that can be extracted from the subcommittee's reports, they've been posted on Twitter, is that they these authors understood that fact really, really, really well, all the way through rejection at Nature, at the Journal of Nature. They knew that there just was not evidence to rule out some very basic lab leak scenarios, which is like, for example, a natural virus or a cultured virus or a virus that had been serially passaged. There's no way to distinguish between that and a natural spillover at the market. But by the time they got through to Nature Medicine, they had given steroids to their letter and claimed that no lab-based scenarios at all were plausible. So here you could, I mean, here the question is how much is it the fault of the journals, for example, in sort of pushing them towards that kind of extreme claim that they knew they could not substantiate with the available scientific data? So for me, the story is not super clear either that they were terrible people. For me, it looks like they had a series of decisions to make about whether to try to disprove an engineered origin, and that kind of snowballed into them eventually writing a letter that claimed that no lab scenario at all was plausible.
Alina, I want to follow up on that. I guess there's a lot to get into, and perhaps once you leave, we'll go back to that point you made about what was going through their mind during this process as revealed by those emails and the Slack chats. But going back to your point about hoping that there can be like a legitimate scientific discussion or hearing about this, you have commented many times that you want to sort of bring everyone together to have such a discussion, or you can think of it as like an origin of COVID conference, and I've sort of messaged you about that and Matt before to see if anyone had sort of thought about that. The question I have for you though is, how do you imagine that could occur, given what many believe are like very, I guess, unethical or insincere actions on behalf of sort of the major players on one side of this? I guess not to, I think the problem is that many of us believe that the science as it's being presented at that hearing is just even the scientists themselves really cannot believe what they're saying. So how can you see such a conference actually happening, I guess, is maybe my question.
Maybe I'm too idealistic, but I do think that a scientific conference on the origins is needed. And of course, not just scientists should be there, but investigative journalists and investigators should also attend, because this question is not just a scientific question, but also a forensic question. But I do think that there is enough science to be debated and discussed, and I don't mean this in the form of let's have a presidential debate style like meeting, but
Right.
but even just having a scientific conference where each person gets to present, and then there are panels where experts can address each question and evaluate the strength of each argument. That kind of debate is urgently needed, because right now the person who wins is the person who is taking over the media. In that sense, the person who has the most media reach is the one who wins. So this shouldn't be how science is conducted. And I agree with Yana's depiction of the situation now, is that people are sort of painting themselves up as victims, heroes, or martyrs. And I think that's not helpful, because it means that who wins is based on the strength of their story, their personal story, rather than the available scientific evidence. And for me as a scientist, I want to bring it back to the core, back to the data. And I think if there were to be such a conference with such panels that are balanced, people in the public would easily see that there is just not that kind of strong evidence for either a natural or lab origin, that there's a lot of direct evidence that's missing and needs to be found.
So, Alina, I guess sorry, go ahead, Yana. I was going to say.
Alina, I'm curious about, you mentioned a little bit the role and responsibility of journals here in what research they publish. And I'm wondering if you can, many of us are thinking of the necessity of stronger regulation on risky pathogen research. But I'm wondering if you have a sense that journals need to begin playing a different role, perhaps, in what it is they publish and how they assess the quality of the material that they publish.
I agree. So I think journals have a immense responsibility and power to regulate this field of research. So again, not all of virology risk starting pandemics. It's just this very niche field of research where novel pathogens are being brought back to city centers and manipulated in ways that could reasonably lead to enhancement of the virus's ability to spread and cause sickness. So I think that right now, all of this hedging of whether or not a lab origin is plausible is delaying that conversation, is delaying these actionable steps towards a future where people are protected from accidents in the lab. So right now, what's happening right now around the world is that there are so many of these labs where if someone just has a bad day, like one accident happens, suddenly billions of lives are put at risk. Like, this is untenable. So yesterday's hearing, we kept hearing from the Democratic members that they wanted to see actionable items. And I think to reach those actionable items, we first have to sort of clean the house, to say, like, what do we know here? What were the steps that obstructed an investigation into a plausible lab origin? So part of that needs to happen first, in my opinion, before there's enough ability to compel journals to do the right thing.
Alina, thank you so much. And we know you have to go, but very much appreciate you joining us. And thank you so much for your work.
Thanks for giving me the floor. I might be back in half an hour, but thanks for letting me go first.
Excellent, fantastic.
Thank you.
Emily, I'd like to turn to you and just ask, if you can speak a little bit more about your experience yesterday, being at the hearing and watching all this happen live, and perhaps, experiencing maybe surprise by this turn in the narrative, where suddenly we've arrived at this point in history where a research-related origin is no longer considered the sinful anti-science conspiracy position that it was until recently.
Well, first of all, I want to say I totally agree that it would be great to see hearings like this grounded in the science and the data. And it's unfortunate that we've had to spend over 3 years now kind of unraveling this idea that we shouldn't dig into the evidence pointing towards a lab origin. I think we've lost a lot of valuable time, and I think that was one of the most important pieces of evidence that came up yesterday, was that Christian Anderson and Robert Geary both briefed the FBI and the CIA early on, when evidence was still relatively fresh. And so I think there's a conversation there about the time and evidence that was lost to what I think was dishonest behavior. But yeah, I think being in the room was informative. I'll say it was interesting that the Democrats didn't seem eager to actually engage with that data and with that science. And I don't know if that's just because they're sort of intimidated by it, or if they don't find it very compelling. I thought it was interesting that Representative Dingell, even as she was, very vocally, aggressively defending Christian Anderson from sort of those quid pro quo allegations, also said, but I'm curious, along with my Republican colleagues, as to whether this was a lab origin. So we haven't seen much engagement with the alleged clustering of early hospitalizations around the wet market. We haven't seen much engagement from Democrats with the environmental data in the wet market, or environmental samples in the wet market. And so that's sort of interesting to observe. And then, I tried to chat with both Anderson and Geary after the hearing, which is very standard process on Capitol Hill. Often reporters will try to, corner witnesses after the hearing for their own questions. And, I asked Christian Anderson, the first question I asked him was, you said that you don't think that scientists who disagree with you are conspiracy theorists. Don't you owe Richard Ebright an apology? Don't you owe Alina Chan an apology? Because that is such a starkly different version of events than what we've heard from you for 3 years. And he said something like, oh, Emily, I think you've gotten all of your questions answered. And then he had a cadre of 3 to 4 lawyers sort of surrounding him, and he walked off and he hid out in the bathroom. And then I tried to talk to Robert Geary and ask him about the fact that it appears as if he misled the intelligence community. At least that's my interpretation of the evidence that we've seen. And once again, his lawyers basically said that he wasn't going to speak to me, and they ducked out into a elevator. So yeah, I mean, other than that, it was just interesting to see some small amount of accountability, and actually see these guys answer real questions, tough questions, because unfortunately my colleagues in the press have not been asking the tough questions. And of course, they'll only talk to friendly reporters. So that was satisfying to a degree. But yeah, it was an interesting day for sure.
Thanks, Emily. Matt, I have a question for you. So you have mentioned how you felt betrayed by the proximal origins paper because you initially relied on it, and your position is, I think, very similar to that of a lot of scientists who've been relying and taking on faith the arguments offered in proximal origins. Can you say a bit about like what specific arguments that could so in light of the fact that Gary and Anderson still say that they stand by those arguments, I think it would be good to highlight some of these arguments that have caused you to really question everything that they say.
Yeah. Let me start, though, by just going back one step to the fact that I was in Parliament at the time. There are 800 people in the House of Lords. It's a very large legislative body. I suspect, I think I'm the only one I know of those 800 who has a PhD in biology. That can't be true. There must be others, but I can't think of one immediately. And so a lot of my colleagues were coming up to me in those weeks and saying, you know a bit about this kind of stuff. I've heard on the grapevine that this could have come out of a lab in Wuhan. And for a period early in March, when Proximal Origin came out, I was responding to such people by saying, no, there's this very clear paper in Nature Medicine which comes to the strong conclusion that it didn't. So I think we can rule that out. Now, I feel bad about that because I think I misled people, because I was myself misled. Now, what was it about Proximal Origin that persuaded me to take that line? It was that the authors seemed to be from relevant backgrounds and that they came to a very firm conclusion. It wasn't that it was itself very persuasive, because I do remember reading it the first time and thinking, well, okay, I don't quite follow why that's such a strong argument. And let me just go through, as you asked me to do, the sort of four arguments that I think they made there, and why I didn't challenge them enough in the first few weeks. First of all, there was a mention of the pangolins. They were in the news at the time, and they seemed to be good candidates for the intermediate species. Well, of course, they didn't have the furin cleavage site, the one feature that we know they hoped the pangolins would have, because it would immediately solve their problem. So they are a complete red herring, and I began to realize that quite quickly. Secondly, there was the argument that this furin cleavage site is suboptimal, and we heard this again from Christian Anderson yesterday. If you were designing it, you'd make it better than that at attracting the attention of furin. Well, there's two problems with that argument. First, why do you think any genetic engineer is going to make it perfect? I mean, that's not a rational thing to say. Of course, he might make a suboptimal furin cleavage site. But secondly, well, it's pretty darn good. it's infected millions of people.
Right. I mean, and that's the ultimate measure when you're doing biology is does it
Right.
work, not does it match a pattern in a textbook.
Exactly. And then there was the argument that, well, they don't, and I don't know whether they made this argument in Proximal Origin or later, but they don't have that backbone in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And again, I probably didn't realize at the time that we didn't know what was in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I hadn't yet come across the point that they had closed their database and they were being extremely unforthcoming about what they had. Finally, there was a funny little phrase in there saying the O-linked glycans are very persuasive here. Well, I'm ashamed to say, despite having a PhD in biology, I hadn't the foggiest idea what an O-linked glycan was at the time. It took me a while to sort of read up and realize it's a glycosylation of proteins that at one end of the amino acids that in some sense screens the protein from the immune system. I think I might have got that wrong, but that's my understanding at present. Well, even Christian Andersen, we now know, very quickly realized that was a non-argument. But the point is, there was just enough of a smokescreen of blinding me with science there for me to fall for this stuff at a time when people were asking me my opinion and I hadn't had a chance to really, really think it through. Within weeks, I had begun to find those arguments extraordinarily flimsy. And we now know from the background emails that the people writing them found them pretty flimsy too. I mean, this is what Christian Andersen says in some of those Slack messages. So it's an episode that is infuriating because of the way the world was deceived, but I personally feel betrayed as well.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel largely the same way. I think it's important for listeners to realize that scientists largely we trust each other when we trust the experts in our field, our respective disciplines. Like we are very reluctant not to defer to established experts in our disciplines because we believe that, well, they're experts for a reason. And if they're saying something, then they probably have very good reason to say that. In particular, if they make some argument in a paper that seems a bit, maybe not very strong, but they have a lot of background knowledge.
Exactly right.
And, I was in the same boat until, I finally started digging into these papers. And I've really come to the conclusion, no, they're just being dishonest. These are dishonest arguments intended to mislead. And there are a number of additional arguments that I think have been intended to mislead. And I was kind of shocked to see Gary making those disingenuous arguments to Congress under oath. And, one thing to appreciate about science is that, it's not just the data, it's the interpretation, right? So the data comes from nature in your experiments, but the interpretation is made by scientists. The arguments are made by scientists. And it seems to me that the authors of the Proximal Origins have grossly abused the assumption that they will be making honest arguments, including in the hearing. They made a number of extremely specious, if not outright false, arguments. So that's been my takeaway. Emily, so does that gel with your take on things?
Yeah, I mean, it's to me borderline offensive that someone would say that this is a suboptimal furin cleavage site when it's killed millions of people. And it was frustrating as someone who knows a lot about proximal origin. to watch the spin happening. And I think they were occasionally called out on it. Anderson kept saying, well, actually it was 54 days or however many, citing the data, the paper published, knowing full well that they had a completed draft within days of the February 1 teleconference. They were called out on that, but there were many times that I felt like they needed a follow-up question. I was like asking the follow-up question in the back to myself, when Anderson said that he doesn't think the diffuse proposal could have created SARS-CoV-2, ask him why, make him explain. When Anderson says that he disagrees with George Gao, that the hospitalization data is biased, ask him why. Ask him to explain. Why doesn't he think that that data is consistent with a super spreader event? And to me, the biggest unresolved question is the question that started this whole controversy 3 years ago. It's, where did that fear and cleavage site come from? It's obvious that they made a decision at some critical point in hours or days in early February to go from saying that this fear and cleavage site looked engineered and that this looked like a lab accident to dismissing the idea that that fear and cleavage site could have arisen in a lab. I would have loved to just, for one of them to say, where did the fear and cleavage site come from? And for them to be really grilled on that, because it's obvious that that question was not resolved by February 2020, because it's still not resolved now. And their feet really weren't put to the fire on that. So
Can I jump in there, Emily? Because having sat on these select committees myself, it is very frustrating that you get a few minutes to ask questions. You take your turn. You don't sort of really get a chance to follow up. It's far too formalized a structure for that. But where it can work, and this is the mistake I think that was made yesterday, is when there are guests who disagree with each other. Not guests, witnesses who disagree with each other, because then you can get them to contradict each other, and that can't be ignored. Alina Chan and I went before the House of Commons Select Committee in London to discuss some of these issues a year and a half ago, and we were able to pin down fellow witness Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, on why he had not insisted on a declaration of interest from Peter Daszak in the letter in February 2020. And his answer was, I did as quickly as I could. And we said, that was 18 months. Is that really as quickly as you could have got so we were able to sort of help the committee hit back at some of the misstatements. And that's just a sort of purely parliamentary point to make, but it wasn't terribly satisfactory. I agree, and some of the Republican congressmen didn't seem to be particularly well briefed, which was a shame.
So I'd like to just go back on this. I have a lot of sympathy for the lawmakers asking these scientists questions, because the scientists are at an inherent advantage because they can just say some technical things, and unless you're really trained in scientific methods, and you've really read up on this, you really can't counter them. And so that's why I view them making disingenuous arguments to be such a violation of the public trust in science. So let me give one example, going back to this fear and cleavage site. So it is clear from the earliest days of discussions among this group of authors that the fear and cleavage site was really the thing that was spooking them out. And proximal origins does not resolve that at all. Proximal origins only says, well, fear and cleavage sites, they're in other coronaviruses, so it is probably just recombination. But the thing is, they knew that that was not true at the time. And let me just read this part of an email from Robert Gary. Now, he was asked about this email, and I believe this is from February 1st or January 31st, 2020. He was asked about this email, and he said, well, this is just one of hundreds of emails I've sent. But let me read the text of this, because this actually perfectly encapsulates my own argument on this point. So he says, before I left the office for the ball, I aligned nCoV, the SARS-CoV-2 genome, with the 96% bat coronavirus sequence at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Except for the receptor binding domain and spike proteins, except for the receptor binding domain, the spike proteins are essentially identical at the amino acid level. Well, all but the perfect insertion of 12 nucleotides that adds the furin site. S2, which is a part of the spike protein, is over its whole length essentially identical. I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus or one very similar to it to SARS-CoV-2, where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, that you don't change any other amino acids in S2. I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. Do the alignment of the spike at the amino acid, then he says to his fellow scientists, do the alignment of the spikes at the amino acid level. It's stunning. Of course, in the lab, it would be easy to generate the perfect 12 base insert you wanted. He wrote that down. And basically that's the argument. That's that's the thing that really spooks me out to this day. It was never addressed in proximal origins. Instead, they make these really weak statements about, anyway. So I just I find it's clear that he did not believe the recombination was possible at this time. And there was no evidence subsequently to that to indicate that recombination of the furin cleavage site into the SARS-CoV-2 genome would be any more likely. So, okay. So,
yeah, just on that, yeah. Justin, if you read the exchanges between Christian Andersen and Andrew Rambo that have been released most recently, they read like really reasonable and really tough questions about why, as Anderson puts it, it's not some fringe theory. It's highly likely that this could have happened.
I agree.
So, actually, you read those and you think, oh, this is good stuff. These people are asking the right questions. They are not taking no for an answer. They're very unpersuaded by Drosten and Fouchier, who are trying to shut this debate down. What happened to these guys? What was it that made them, on that phone call on the first weekend in February 2020, go from these reasonable tough questions to some kind of strange towing of the line in order to shut down an argument for what looks awfully like political reasons?
I completely agree.
I get
Jana?
Oh, sorry, Jana, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, I guess I'm listening to this conversation. I'm thinking, and this is a question for all of you and anyone who's willing to take it. But what strikes me here is that, Matt, you were talking earlier about how you realized in the end that proximal origin was a pretty flimsy argument, and really, when you start scratching the surface, connecting the dots is quite difficult. And then on top of that is, we've been aware now for a while of some behind the scenes communications that, Now, some have involved very good questions, which did not appear in the actual proximal origin letter, and also some communications that, of course, have raised eyebrows, to say the least. And then also, of course, all of us have witnessed just truly unbelievably aggressive and unprofessional behavior on the part of many of these scientists involved. And sometimes this aggressive behavior has targeted just ordinary members of the public who are affected by the pandemic, and they're just innocently trying to make sense of what has happened. And yet, despite all of that, that's highly problematic. We are 3+ years into the pandemic, and the narrative about the natural origin holds strong. The individuals involved are seen by many, including one entire party in the United States, as vulnerable and needing protection. The media, lawmakers, the scientific community are kind of almost rallying around these individuals and the dogma that they have generated. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that. I think that alarms me, because it seems like this, we are really not just talking about a couple of bad apples and this misstep. We're talking about in collusion of numerous incredibly powerful institutions, including, of course, the science establishment and the media, um, to deceive the public and to really not listen to or be even curious about signs that there's something very wrong with this master narrative and with the way in which the public is treated. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and what does it say about the scientific community's relationship to society?
Can I jump in quickly on that? Because I think it's a really good question. And for me, there is an appalling disconnect now between what the public thinks happened, which is by a significant majority that it probably did leak from a lab, and what the scientific establishment thinks, which is that that's a mad conspiracy theory that can be confined to the dustbin and should never even be debated. And if you think that, if you are in the scientific establishment and you think that it's mad to believe it came out of a lab, then you should be very disturbed by the fact that the majority of the public believes that. And you should be out there day in, day out, demanding debates, putting stuff in the public domain to try and change that perception in the public. Whereas what actually happens is that they don't want to debate. They want it to go quietly away. I've recounted before my attempts to get the Royal Society in Britain or the Academy of Medical Sciences to hold debates on this topic, open-ended debates. And the answer I get is no, we can't discuss that. That's a controversial subject. Well, it's the very reason you should discuss it, in my view.
Can I add to that, Matt, going back to a point you made earlier about the notable omission of experts that would speak in opposition to Anderson and Gary? I think that is actually very telling because, of course, if the committee did want to sort of put the, Anderson and Gary's feet to the fire, they would have invited Alina or yourself or Richard or Jesse Bloom to sit there and point out that a lot of these arguments they're making are completely ridiculous. So I do think that maybe sort of perhaps the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the fact that it may simply be that it's not just the Democrats that are kind of closing ranks here. It's that also the Republicans are, like, all governments are kind of closing ranks on how much they really want this stuff to come out, because at the end of the day, this is going to connect back into biodefense and military programs. And I know that is where it gets a little bit complicated to speak about, but you notice, the New York Times article today had a couple lines I thought were notable. One was, it says, after the hearing, Mr. Wenstrup shook Dr. Anderson's hand and said he hoped Dr. Anderson felt the hearing was professional. I think if the accusations Mr. Wenstrup was making about Anderson, if he really felt that way, I wouldn't want to shake Christian's hand. The other point is that at the end of that article, it has this quote about Fauci claiming now that there are two people that have testified under oath that he had no involvement in the planning of the thing of proximal origin. So I think that there is this continued undertow of making sure that Fauci is protected. I would argue the reason is it's because of his role in biodefense over the last 2 decades. It's his role as a part of the U.S. military and what it would mean for him to become under fire for that. So I don't want to throw out a very complicated. I don't want to bring us into that necessarily, but I do think that is something to be taken because we're asking a lot of questions like, oh, I don't understand this. I don't understand this. Well, something like, as you point out, people are not wanting to discuss this. And usually when people don't want to discuss certain things, it's because there are very, very powerful, things at work. Anyway, so I'll stop with that. But I do want to, I guess Alina is back. Alina, do you want to return to can we talk a little bit about what that potential scientific conference would look like? Because there is a point of, for the origins of COVID, because there is this thing that bothers me, and I know Yana as well, that you have, how do you really involve people that, as Justin would point out, you think you believe are just flat out being untruthful? How can you actually have a legitimate discussion about this with people that will not be honest in that discussion?
Well, I think that at a scientific conference, it is possible to call out people on their assumptions or limitations, and that's why it's important to have one. And the hearings, in my opinion, are not great places to do that, because it's so technical and the amount of time is so little. I mean, some of these hearings, it's almost more of every representative having their say on it rather than actual questions being posed to the witnesses. So I mean, there would have been so many more questions that I had hoped would be put to both Anderson and Gary about their assumptions about the data that they accessed and when, and why they didn't just go directly to EcoHealth Alliance through the NIH to look at their progress reports. But I think that for such a scientific conference to be organized, it has to come from a bipartisan organization or body. So something like the COVID-19 Commission Planning Group, I feel has the responsibility and the power to organize such a conference, but so far has not done so. The problem right now with the scientific narrative or claims of scientific consensus is that there simply has not been a platform to allow that to happen. We see that a lot of journal editors in virology and big journal editors like Science have a clear preference for a natural origin. So in this current situation where the media and scientific journals have a preferred narrative towards a market origin, it's not possible to have a balanced and direct exchange or debate amongst scientists.
But as Matt pointed out, why do you think that the committee didn't invite somebody else? They knew very well that what Gary and Anderson was going to say, they weren't going to be able to contradict that. So it would have been very easy for them to invite Jesse Bloom, for example, or you, right? So why do you think they didn't invite somebody to provide that counter that would allow it to work in those situations?
I think in the case of yesterday's hearing, they were not so much interested in the science, which I perceive that both Democratic and Republican representatives believe is ambiguous, that the science doesn't point in any one direction and the lab is too plausible. But yesterday's hearings objectives seem to be holding accountable scientists who privately conspired, I guess, to try and shut down a lab origin, even an accidental lab origin, very early on in 2020. So for that reason, I guess that's why they didn't bring in scientists to their own detriment, which I think would have helped. Just having other scientists there to say, no, these claims are overconfident, they're not based on strong evidence. But I mean, I've been kind of frustrated watching this happen over the past 3 years. Is that every year I thought that finally a bipartisan panel or commission or investigation would be launched, but that just seems to not have happened. And I wonder whether it's because people are content not knowing where the origin comes from, or they've just settled with their favorite hypothesis and don't need an investigation to happen? Or just like why isn't there bipartisan support to launch a formal investigation into origins of COVID-19?
Well, that's why I would say, going back to my point, because it's going to touch on U.S. military, and what is there another explanation that would make sense? That explains why 3.5 years into something that's killed over 1 million Americans is not being investigated 24/7 in a bipartisan way. It just seems quite. I mean, we can talk about how odd it is, but I did. But to your point, Alina, you're right. I guess that it is correct that yesterday's hearing was pitched more as a, look at what these scientists were saying behind closed doors. Not necessarily a science conference, a science issue, but more of this cover up, which is why I do want to, Emily, do you have, I did want to talk more about the Slack chats and the emails what emerged, some of the new stuff that emerged. Did you have
Yeah, just
you want to sort of
quickly on
summarize some of this?
the committee, I haven't asked them this question. Often, you'll see 2 witnesses for the majority and 2 witnesses for the minority. I think the Democrats had invited Farrar, who obviously didn't show up. I don't think they, thought that he would actually show up. But so that might have something to do with it. This is pure speculation, but also just an observation I'll make is that they were successful in getting 2 of the virologists involved to cooperate. So, Michael Farzan apparently cooperated, and so did Ian Lipkin. And also I'll just reiterate that, when I talked to Anderson and Gary, they were surrounded by 3 or 4 lawyers each. So I haven't talked to the committee about this myself, so I would need to confirm, but it's possible that they're wrangling with some very smart, hardworking attorneys in Washington as they set up these hearings. So that's pure speculation. Just what I would observe, having covered a lot of hearings over the course of my time in Washington.
Hey, I'd like to just build on what you guys have said about scientists shutting down debate and why it's important, particularly in this issue. So just to zoom out. So, I mean, the key question for me in the origins of COVID-19 has been this, has the scientific process worked or has it failed? And specifically, did science work in that discussions among scientists, published papers, and interactions of scientists with the public, did it shed light on the origins of COVID-19 in a disinterested manner? Or did these discussions, papers, and interactions obscure the origins of COVID-19? And in particular, did they obscure the origin in a manner that benefits the scientists involved? And I believe that science has failed dramatically, and that this failure has been systemic. That is not just the result of 1 or 2 bad actors, but from a whole system that rewards compliance and silence when the issue of science, the role that science itself plays in society, is brought up. And I think this issue, this systemic failure, if not corruption, urgently needs to be addressed. And I consider, and I think many people do, the proximal origins of SARS-CoV-2 to be the focal point of this failure. So in particular, I think it's important for the public to realize how self-serving the acceptance of the specious arguments provided by proximal origins is by the scientific community and by virology in particular. It's important to realize how much a lab-based origin of SARS-CoV-2 would damage the entire field of virology, as well as other fields of biomedical research. It's important to realize how much a lab-based origin of SARS-CoV-2 would damage the whole biodefense infrastructure. How much a lab-based origin would specifically harm funding agencies like NIH and USAID that funded dangerous research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, as well as and how much it would harm the specific funding administrators, in particular Anthony Fauci, Collins, and Jeremy Farrar, that had vocally supported dangerous gain-of-function research over the previous decade. And so it is absolutely important to understand that when scientists try to shut down debate on the origins of SARS-CoV-2, it is incredibly self-serving. I think I am very concerned that there was a corrupting influence from the science administrators, particularly on the writing of the writing of proximal origins, and that proximal origins was designed specifically to shut down this debate. So, I think with a lot of the stuff in the hearing, it's easy to see it as petty or, gossipy. But in fact, it really goes to the heart of, is science working or is science corrupted?
Justin, can I come in on that? First of all, just a little point about the funding. As I understand it, the argument was made yesterday that because these guys had already given Christian Andersen and Robert Gary a lot of money, they didn't think it was a conflict of interest to go along with what Fauci and co wanted.
Okay.
Well, last time I checked, if somebody's just given you a lot of money, you do have a conflict of interest.
Well, there are really two answers to that question. So Anderson's statement about the conflicts of interest was completely absurd, and it's hard to believe not knowingly so, because of 2 points. The first is that the mechanics of the mechanics of how this works at the NIH. The merit review process for the grant had been completed. That is actually the process in which the agency that gives the grant is not involved. The part of the process in which the specific agency that awards the money is involved is between the time of the merit scoring and between the time of the merit scoring and the awarding of the grant. And that can be many months. So it is ridiculous to say that the head of the agency had no say on that particular grant, which was actually a very big grant. But there's a broader point, which is that scientists rely on scientists rely throughout their careers on one or a small number of specific funding agencies. And you want to be on the best terms with those funding agencies throughout your entire career. Just because they had gotten previous grants from NIAID, and this one center grant had been scored in the fundable range. You're absolutely right, Matt. You still want to be on good terms with them so you can get money later. And it's not just money, right? It's the that's your entire career, right? That's if you're going to influence government policy, if you're going to you want to be in those circles. So there is no bigger conflict. There is no one in a position to present a bigger conflict of interest to a scientist than the head of that scientist's primary funding agency at all times.
Can I just come to your more general point about the corruption of science? It's not, of course, news to someone like me that scientists sometimes behave in self-interested ways, that there is a degree of motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, all these other problems that mean that science isn't quite the perfectly dispassionate procedure that it likes to pretend. But for me, this episode has been a pretty big wake-up call in terms of making me think that there is something rotten in the state of science. And I don't mean by that there's anything wrong with the philosophy of scientific inquiry or the behavior of the vast majority of scientists. But I think there is something corrupting in the structure of the scientific establishment, scientific institutions going on. And it's exactly what you said, the relationship with the funders, the relationship with your career advancement opportunities, etc., mean that it is really quite easy to mistake self-interest and self-deception for virtue, if you like. And what would keep that honest, what would help, would be external challenge. Whether it's accountability to government or whether it's accountability to the media, what keeps businessmen honest, what keeps sportsmen honest, what keeps politicians honest is the fact that somebody's out there asking them all good questions if they start to do some dodgy things. And at the moment, that doesn't happen in science because the scientific media are on the whole cheerleaders, not challengers. I mean, even artists, get covered in the media by people called art critics. There is no such thing as a science critic, and that,
Right.
well, possibly Alina and I are now, but that feels to me like the root of this problem.
Yeah, I agree.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions, and then Bryce will ask a final question, and we'd like to open this up to questions from folks who are participating today. So if you're listening and you have questions for our guests, please start, just raising your hand so that we can see you and give you the mic. The couple of questions I have. One is a clarifying one for Alina, and I'm wondering if you could give us an update on the Pathogens Project and the report that I think might be coming out sometime soon. And then the other question and / concern I have that I would love all of your thoughts on is that, some of what has been talked about in this specific session, I think would be a real shock to many members of the public who are trained to see science as our ultimate hold on reality and as a method of knowledge making that is reliable and and that has the right checks and that can be trusted. And here, we in this one conversation, we've talked about how journals and others in the scientific community have a clear preference for the natural origin theory, which I think is just stunning to really think about, that there's a preconceived idea of how things should be in the real world. We're talking about scientists shutting down debates. We're talking about a relationship of weakness and dependence of funding recipients with their funders. Like, all of these things are, very present in the world of science, but I don't think that they're known very well by generally members of the public. At the same time, what we're facing is that right now, I mean, the only community that has been given by our society the authority to label people anti-science and conspiracy theorists is really the scientific community. And so we have the scientific community, by and large, behaving in an anti-science manner. And we also have the scientific community really being the only community that our society accepts, labeling others as anti-science. So any external challenge that Matt, you were saying is needed, and I agree completely, is at risk of having, whoever launches that challenge labeled anti-science and shut down. And so what we have is, and Matt, you were saying earlier that most members of the public, it looks like, according to polls, et cetera, believe that this must have been a research-related accident. But you have, members of the public who are actually stepping outside of their own many times training and expertise, and who are seeing that there's something very wrong. in what our officially sanctioned truth tellers are telling us. And so members of the public who are questioning all that, and yet it is really the scientific community that has the authority to label these members of the public anti-science and shut them down. So there's this incredible reversal of the people who are doing the real critical thinking and painstaking work of trying to figure this out being called anti-science, and the anti-science thinkers being the ones who are holding who are driving the bus on what's reality. And I find this just unbelievably dangerous at the moment. It's a problem that's, on a global scale. And I would really love your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I have to jump off quickly after this comment, but I think some of the things that you've brought up and Bryce has brought up too are really striking. Is that how scientists have handled this crisis has been honestly quite shameful. I mean, imagine if in the beginning of the whole thing, Peter Daszak, like the EcoHealth Alliance president and collaborator of the WIV, and other scientists had come forward and said, lab accidents happen, we need to investigate, and assign responsibility fairly. If they just said that and admitted that the work was an international collaboration, then there wouldn't have been all this racism and stigma and conspiracy theorizing being thrown about. But instead, he and others, including Jeremy Farrar, who convened the proximal origin authors, quickly put out a letter condemning any suggestion of a non-natural origin as a conspiracy theory. This was published in The Lancet, another huge journal where there is a preference for a natural origin. So I agree that this needs to be fixed before the next crisis, before the next lab-based outbreak, if this one came from a lab. So I think many of these have to be addressed, and that was part of the motivations for organizing Pathogens Project with the Bulletin Atomic, is to try and get together a group of very international scientists and experts, because this is not a US only or a China only problem. This is like the whole world is involved in this type of research. And I believe that the task force is one of the most moderate, most balanced panels in existence debating this topic right now, and international and diverse also in expertise. And we've been working really hard in after the conference to gather our thoughts, to put together a report which will come out, I think, at the end of the year. And we have many things we're considering, but our purpose is not to put out another list of guidelines, but to put out very specific recommendations, things that can be acted on immediately, to make sure that there's as much buffer as possible between a scientist having a bad day in the lab and the rest of the world having to deal with a pandemic.
So thanks, Alina. Are you going to stick around for a little bit?
Yeah, maybe for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have one question for Emily, or whoever else wants to chime in, and then I want to go to the open it up for questions from the audience. So this comes from, I guess, to try to summarize the new revelations from the Slack chats and the emails. Would you agree? I'm just going to read something that Richard posted, like in summarizing. If you agree with this statement, or you think it's not necessarily fully accurate. Do you think that the new stuff that came out and the report that was accompanying it indicated that there was clear contradiction of the false claims by the proximal origin authors, that their analysis clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a lab construct or a purposely manipulated virus? That's point one. And then the second one is, do you believe that the new Slack chats and the emails explicitly contradict the authors' repeated false claims that they had rejected their initial working hypothesis by the end of the telecon on February 1st, 2020? Is that an accurate framing? I believe it is, but I wanted to ask you if you also thought so.
I'm eager to hear what the scientists think, but my impression is that, given the abruptness of their change in opinion, I don't think it was unreasonable to ask, did they truly believe what they wrote in Proximal Origin? And my interpretation of the new Slacks just in the last few hours is that they kind of show in black and white that they did not believe what they were saying. My understanding of that letter is that a central premise is that they would have been working with a known backbone. And you can see in Anderson's Slacks that he was not persuaded by that argument and yet made it to nearly 6 million people, thousands of news organizations, and hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers. And so to me, it looks like they were dishonest rather than biased. That's my opinion.
Matt or Alina, did you want to offer a opinion on that?
Yeah, I'll go first. So we do know that when they were rejected by Nature, the journal, in mid-February, they knew and they wrote to the editor there saying that they could not distinguish between an accidental lab escape and a natural spillover of the market. But by the time their paper went through Nature Medicine, they had come out saying that no lab-based scenarios are plausible. So for me, the question is, how did that happen? What was within that such a short time frame? How did they go from realizing that they could not they could not tell whether it was a lab escape to saying that we know that no lab-based scenarios are plausible? Was this something that the journal forced them to do, or was it something that they decided to do in order to get their publication out? So here, I think it's a very important question for science and evaluating whether the science like scientists can be trusted to self-evaluate questions where there can be very negative consequences for science.
As a general rule, it's important not to underestimate human capacity for self-deception. And it is possible for someone, if it coincides with his or her self-interest, to believe something very passionately and devoutly, as it were. So it's not impossible that they did persuade themselves that they had found strong enough evidence to convince themselves that a lab leak was not even remotely possible. But it's very hard in this case to square that with the strong and, as I say, rather good statements they made days earlier, challenging some of the arguments against them. It's one of the more striking U-turns one has seen in terms of people's conclusions about an important subject. By the way, I think it's always worth keeping in the background here that we're talking about beginning of February 2020, when it might remain a little local difficulty that causes a nasty problem in Wuhan but doesn't go global. And you can sort of get away with a bit of sloppy thinking, a bit of naughty behavior, because nobody's going to look into it. The idea that 3 years later people would be having Twitter spaces to discuss your emails would not have occurred to them.
So I just want to also point out one thing that came out, which I think was really cool, from the committee's report, the PDF. Francisco de Assis, one of the drastic people, found full unredacted emails buried inside. And some of these emails are pretty revealing. So, in ways that were not mentioned by the committee, or released by the committee. So in particular, on February 16th, right before the proximal origin manuscript submission on February 18th, Eddie Holmes wrote about the manuscript that they had developed. Jeremy Farrar and Francis Collins are very happy about the manuscript. We should invite Francisco to. He's here. To me, that is super troubling. Jeremy Farrar is the head of the Wellcome Trust, one of the biggest funding agencies in the UK. Francis Collins was head of the NIH, the biggest biomedical funding agency in the United States. Why were these people caring if they were happy? That is such an incredible conflict of interest that was not revealed at all in the proximal origins paper itself. It absolutely calls into question whether the proximal origins paper was the independent judgment of scientists or was influenced by people in governments and funding agencies. I think there's absolutely reason to believe that, there could have been, that these scientists could have been persuaded to say things that they didn't believe. Go ahead, Bryce.
Did Matt and Emily, do you want to say a couple final words or final thoughts before we sign off? And Yana as well. I don't know if you want to, Matt, you want to go first?
I've said quite enough, and I've got to go and feed my dogs.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's been great. Thank you a lot, Emily. You have any final thoughts?
Just thanks for everyone's continued interest in this. Washington would like nothing more than for this to just go away and for us to not have to think about it. But I think it's so important, and I'm glad that everyone on this call agrees.
By the way, Emily, great. You're doing an amazing job. U.S. Right to Know, I would definitely tell everyone to check out everything that they've been reporting on this topic. And you especially have been doing an incredible work. So we all are very appreciative of that. Yana, did you have any final words?
Just thank you very much, Matt. Emily, Alina has left us, but very much appreciate your time. We know that you have very, very busy lives and schedules, and I really do consider these meetings as one perhaps simple form of resistance that is really necessary given the circumstances that we're in. And Emily, exactly what you said, given that there are a lot of powerful institutions who do not want the public and people like us to be talking about these issues. So thank you, everybody, for participating. And we look forward to the next conversation.